Good morning, our names are Miguel, Ángel, Córdoba, Romero and Paula Albarracín, and we will be talking today about early American poetry. We'll especially deal with Poe, Whitman and Dickinson and some poems that we will analyze. We will talk about different aspects of this early American poetry. First, we'll start with some important facts about the historical context that then will influence the poetry of those years. And then we will talk about Walt Whitman, Edgar Allan Poe, and Emily Dickinson. Okay, so my name is Miguel Ángel, and let's start with the context, the historical context. The American 19th century is governed by the American Romanticism that went approximately from the early 19th century till the end of the Civil War. Mathieson also calls this period American Renaissance, understood not as a rebirth of values, but as America's way of producing a renaissance. It's important also to take into account the huge impact of the French Revolution of 1789, showing how the will, desire, and actions of individuals meant and could do more than established traditional society and its values. Before the assumed start of the American Romanticism stage, we can see how independence was a key political idea. In 1775, the American Revolution takes place, where the colonies seek political independence and also a known identity. In 1776, Paine's pamphlet Common Sense starts to be spread around the colonies, and the idea of independence goes even farther, whose culprit is the Declaration of Independence of 1776. There are mentions about the man as equal with life and liberty rights, along with also the pursuit of happiness, and that was surely a good base for the American Romanticism to come. We find two more wars also after this, and these ones are more related to control desires, for example the Northwest Indian War in 1786, and also the British-American War in 1812. Therefore, as we can see, the American Romanticism was parallel to a period of national expansion, national identity, and the rise of an American voice. In North America, we also need to consider the emergence of the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, with the creation of many textile mills and also the double-cylinder steam press, which led to an increase of newspaper production and a journalistic revolution according to Reynolds. This was also a reason why information and knowledge spread in such a fast manner. Another element to consider in the historical background of North America is the philosophical panorama. There was indeed an epistemological shift where the source of knowledge stops being reason and turns to imagination, farther than the rational or the empirical. We could say consequently that the American Romanticism had its roots also in Transcendentalism, whose main leader was Emerson. Emerson did already foresee and state the key concepts that would be then spreading American Romantic literature, for example self-reliance, individualism. Transcendentalism was still a reaction against previous 18th century rationalism, in the same way that Romanticism in general was also a reaction against neoclassicism, a period of objectivity, scientific rationalization, and many restraints. It was the necessity to be freed from the constraints of artificial social conventions and explore themselves through self-expression in such a critical period for North America. Thoreau was also key in this philosophical panorama, dealing with the matter of independence in his well-known work Civil Disobedience, where he claimed that the individual was higher and independent than any state. When talking about American Romanticism, Whitman is a key figure as one of the most famous and influential poets in American literature. He was born in New York in 1819 and died in 1892. He was not only a poet, but also a thinker dealing with politics, democracy, equality, and the American life. Whitman introduces also a new style of poetry, the free verse. This was obviously an attempt to break again with the limitations and constraints and come up with an energetic American style, which was quite much the historical situation at that time. Not only that, but Whitman also deals with topics that were not considered proper before, like sexuality, prostitution, slavery, or religion. There are also some philosophical ideas that will be implicit throughout his poetry, for example, the identification of the American nation with himself, the importance of self-expression, the importance of democracy in his readers, and the attachment between soul, nature, and God. To explain further details on Whitman's poetry, we will be analyzing O Me, O Life. When analyzing O Me, O Life, it's important to consider that there is no established metrics or rhyme, not following any previous convention. This is something that obviously Whitman did purposely, as he was against traditions, and this poem structure is also a reflection on how human nature is as well no order but just disorder. However, it's important to note that while the starting words of each verse are all identical, anaphora, the endings are completely different and lack any rhyme or order. In this way, he tries to show how everything origins conventionally from somewhere, but at the end, the destination is unknown and uncertain, like the actual situation at the time in the United States. The poem, by what we can see, is divided in two well-defined parts, as you can see in these boxes. The first one from verse 1 to 7, then a Demeter verse in line 8, dividing the two sections, and finally the second section and conclusion from line 9 to line 10. We'll also find caesura in many of the verses, but we will analyze these separately. The first section already starts with a clear lamentation about me and about life in two spondees. These lamentations already foresee the topic and coincide with the title of the poem, which will deal with the constant lamentations about oneself and about the life that we live. This section will be a question about the reason for existence, as we'll see later. But in this first verse, we find the start of this lamentation and a claim about questions of this recurring. He refers that we are continuously posing these questions about ourselves and our lives, and that is shown also by the anaphoric use of the preposition of, giving that sense of recurrence of these questions. The poem in this verse talks about the endless trains of the faithless and cities filled with the foolish. The use of the words trains and cities can be seen as a critique to this fast-moving period that dehumanizes in a way individuals, and which also makes people faithless, with a possible double meaning, with nothing to believe on religiously or being disloyal, and foolish, lacking good judgment. So these two qualities are well joined together by the alliteration of the starting voiceless labiodental fricative sound, F, which establishes an implicit connection between both adjectives. In the third verse, the poetic voice inserts himself in this panorama of faithless and foolish people. So Whitman dealt in many of his poems with the matter of democratization, which was the key concern of his literary vision, and so he includes himself within the general lamentation. We can see also how the general structure of the poem is broken with parentheses, which are not common in the poem, in order to reinforce that he is not alienated from those people. In the fourth verse, he talks about common issues in our human lives, for example, desire, understanding, struggling. These issues continue in the fifth and sixth verse, where he uses pessimistic and negative vocabulary to refer to the continuation of these struggles. In the fifth verse, we must take into account the alliteration of the plosive sound p, even possibly recalling the sound of spitting. In the sixth verse, the idea of democratization is again brought up. So he thinks about the empty and useless years of the rest, but at the same time, his life is intertwined with theirs, and he emphasizes this interconnection by repeating the word rest in both hemistichs. All this first section is summarized in the seventh verse, where he recalls the adjective recurring that he used in the first verse, and uses exactly the same lamentation, where he introduces with a dash the real question: what good amid this, O me, O life? What good is there in my existence? We must notice that all throughout this section we find a constant alliteration of the f sound, which tries to illustrate that despair and tiredness of the person who questions all these things. This question is then given an answer, as the Demeter verse shows, in the second section, which is dominated by an aphora of that in both verses. But he starts using the pronoun you, addressing the reader directly, and claims the final solution, that you are here, that life exists. The mere existence is worth living. And he introduces also the term identity, which was another of his key concepts, if you remember from what I said before. Finally, the last verse, the 10th, concludes the poem with a very strong semantic and metaphorical charge. In that the powerful play goes on, life is compared to a play following the Theatrum Mundi conceit, and that is powerful and that is fueled by each individual, as he'll continue saying. You may contribute a verse, so your existence is enough, life goes on, and you can just expect to add something from your own to it, in order to give hope and motive to yourself, others, and the ones to come.
My name is Paula Albarracín López, and I am going to talk about Edgar Allan Poe and Emily Dickinson. Edgar Allan Poe was born in 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States of America, and died in 1849 in Baltimore, in the state of Maryland. His life was deeply troubled, painful, and short. He was raised by foster parents after his mother passed away, and later went to the University of Virginia, but he was expelled because of his gambling losses. Poe published his first pamphlet of poems, which was youthful and Byronic. Poverty forced him to join the army, but his foster mother could pay for his release sometime later. Then he began to write stories and afterwards worked as an editor and a writer for several periodicals. He ended up losing his job because of his drinking habits. He rarely took drugs, but when he did, it was in public, so people thought that he was an addict. Poe died at the age of 40 for unknown reasons, although the possibilities of alcohol or heart failure being the cause are contemplated. He was one of the first American writers to make a living solely by writing, and created two new literary forms: the detective story, for example his tale, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and the horror thriller. His works are characterized by being mysterious and macabre. They are also extremely autobiographical but distort and exaggerate reality. His poems are musical, with many sound effects, and with lyrics inspired by the uncanny, for example his most popular one, The Raven, or women, like Annabel Lee. Poe's work has been extremely influential, and its adaptation to other books, TV series, and movies is very common. To exemplify Poe's poetry, we are going to analyze A Dream Within a Dream. It consists of two stanzas, the first one of 11 verses and the second one of 13. The rhyme is characterized mainly of rhyming couplets, with two exceptions of rhyming tercets, the first 3 lines and from the 5th to the 7th line of the second stanza. The rhythm is very irregular. We can identify iambic trimeters, but there are a lot of exceptions, which include an extra syllable at the beginning. Moving to the meaning of the poem, the first stanza is written as if someone were saying goodbye to their beloved. At the end, the poet establishes that life is an illusion, that is, that all we are or perceive is a dream within a dream. In the second stanza, the poet stands on a beach, now by himself, holding the sun in his hands, and cries when he is not able to grasp it, as the sand slips through his fingers. This could be him comparing the sun to time, as if it were an hourglass. He cannot stop time from passing and slipping away. The end of the stanza has a similar end to the first one, only a single word is changed, is, but it turns the previous statement into a rhetorical question. Even the uncertainty of life is uncertain. Throughout the poem, there are many enjambments that reinforce the feeling that this is an excerpt of the poet's mind, as if it were his stream of consciousness. We can also see some parallel structures. There are 2 examples of anaphora, one in each stanza. The first example includes in a plus a noun, and then or in and a noun or pronoun. In addition, in the second stanza, we find another example, separated by a verse. The structure begins with an apostrophe calling to God, and then can I not plus a verb. Furthermore, Poe used a diacope in the phrase that gives name to the poem, a dream within a dream. There is an episuxis in the second stanza in which he repeats "while I weep" to emphasize his desperation and sadness. The most commonly used device in these poems are sound effects. It is full of alliteration, assonance, and consonance. To portray an example of the alliteration, we can observe the episuxis previously analyzed, in which the voice labiovelar approximant is repeated, or the final lines, in which the voiceless alveolar fricative and the voice alveolar plosive are echoed. There is also a repetition of the voice alveolar nasal in both beginning and central position in the verses "in a night or in a day," "in a vision or in none." We can observe assonance of the U, the O, and the long vowel I in the verses "You are not grown Hujim, that my days have been a dream." This carefully designed sound system proves the attention to detail that Poe puts in the musicality of his poems. Now I'm going to talk about Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson was born in 1839 in Amherst, Massachusetts, in the United States of America, and died in 1886 in the same place. She began writing in the 1850s, but until her mid-20s she wrote mostly letters characterized by being full of humor, anecdotes, invention, and dark and deep reflections. When Dickinson began writing poetry, she stuck to the basic quatrains and meters commonly used in the Protestant hymns and in ballads, with 3 or 4 fifth lines, but experimented with language and prosody, aiming for precise and vivid words as well as epigrammatic concision. Her lyrics were decimally simple, but were actually full of depth and intensity. Dickinson avoided public life, as well as giving explicit and direct answers to whatever she was asked about her as a poet or as a person. She lived reclusively in her family home in her birthplace, and her withdrawal from society was almost complete by the time she was in her 30s. Dickinson was reluctant to publish. She wrote nearly 1,800 poems, but only 10 were published during her lifetime. She also sent some of them to her friends and correspondents. She composed manuscripts that contain around 800 poems, but what she intended to do with them is unknown. Her work clearly reflected the stages of her life and shows evidence of her outstanding and dramatic evolution. Dickinson poetry is distinguished by the high intellectual content, her enigmatic wisdom, the moving personal voice, and the lack of high polish. Her themes include love, death, and nature. She had mature religious opinions and eluded specifications. She had no interest in establishing the doctrinal or critical definition of her beliefs. She was influenced by transcendentalism and liberal Protestant orthodoxy. As an example, we are going to analyze Dickinson's poem number 632. It is composed of 3 quatrains following the ballad form that rhyme ACBC, DEFE, and GHEH. The rhythm alternates between iambic tetrameters and trimeters. There are caesuras that give power to the rhythm of the poem. The main topic of this poem is the greatness of the human mind, represented by the brain, which is compared to the width of the sky, the depth of the ocean, and the weight of God. In the first 2 comparisons, the mind exceeds their power, whereas in the case of the third, it is almost completely equivalent. The comparisons seem absurd, but the actual meaning is hidden. In the first stanza, she refers to the fact that we cannot physically see the sky in its entirety, but our mind is able to grasp the concept completely because we are able to imagine even what we cannot see. Even so, the mind can even contain you. In the second stanza, the brain is compared to the sea in the same way that a sponge is related to a bucket. The sponge seems smaller, but is capable of absorbing the bucket's contents, and the brain can absorb the entire sea. Lastly, the third stanza differs, as the mind is equalized to the weight of God, which are almost identical in the same way as a syllable is closely similar to the sound, to the extent that some may think that the terms are interchangeable. Nevertheless, their relationship is somehow dependent in only one way. Whereas every time there is a syllable, there is also a sound, the case is not the same vice versa. A syllable is dependent on a sound. It is its predecessor. Therefore, even though we are similar to God, we are dependent of Him. The most evident resource of wordplay that Dickinson uses are the schemes of parallelism and anaphora. The 3 stanzas start with "the brain is" plus a comparative. The last stanza is different, and the comparison is of equality instead of superiority, as the mind overpowers the sea and the sky by far, but is more similar to God. The second verses begin with for, then a verb plus the pronoun them, and a diacope separated by a preposition. The third verse is parallel in the first and second stanzas, composed by the one, the other will, and a verb. Again, the last stanza includes an innovation, whereas in the previous ones the statements have been clearly acknowledged, there is a new sense of doubt introduced between two dashes. The poet is not sure whether the weight of God and the brain will differ slightly or nothing at all. The last verb of the last two stanzas is a simile beginning with us. The poet uses a metonymy to talk about the human mind using brain. There are also enjambments throughout the poem, from the third to fourth verses of each stanza. Lastly, Dickinson gives musicality to the poem by sound effects, such as the assonance highlighted. Here is the bibliography that we have used. This is the end of our presentation. We hope that you have enjoyed it, and thank you for your attention.